Alright, so we all know power and spin have kind of been the name of the game in pickleball for the past couple of years, but I like going against the grain a bit, so today we're going to talk about the top 5 best pickleball paddles for control. Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. So yes, control paddles have lost a bit of their appeal over the years. There have been massive developments in tech, and being able to generate so much spin has added a big layer of skill gap to the sport. Still, at its core, pickleball separates itself from other paddle and racket sports because of the soft, methodical control shots you can hit, because of course, the kitchen adds such a unique element of tactics to the game. Perfectly dropping a shot into the kitchen can be the difference between a good player and a great player, and there are definitely some pickleball paddles that help you more in that regard. A lot of the paddles that have quote-unquote revolutionized the spin game do so by sacrificing that soft control, and there are a lot of players, especially those who have been playing this sport for a while, who kind of miss that feeling. Now of course, before we go on, let me remind you that any of the paddles we're going to talk about today you can check out on our website racketsandrunners.ca. And please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. So today we're going to talk about the 5 best pickleball paddles for control, and obviously one of the primary things a lot of players look for in a control paddle is softness. Softer paddles soak up a bit more of the ball's energy during impact, so you get longer dwell time and more of this ability to guide the ball while it's in the paddle face. It's a very addictive sensation that a lot of players like, and of course a lot of the best control paddles will have this softness. But just because a paddle isn't super soft doesn't mean it still can't be very good for control. Soft paddles can have good feel, but a lot of them suffer from what I call mushiness, the sensation of disconnect between you and the ball because they're so pillowy and undefined. The firm response of a thermoform paddle makes for a very crisp connection to the ball, and while a lot of thermoform paddles are too stiff to make this list, some companies have been doing a very good job of softening up that contact while still having that excellent feel. On this list, there's going to be a combination of those very soft plusher paddles as well as those more tame thermoform paddles. I have to say, around May or June of last year, I was a little scared that control paddles were going to be a thing of the past, but since then there have been some amazing releases. Without further ado, let's get into number 5. Coming in at number 5, we have the Rhombus R1 Nova. Now I'm not going to lie, this one may be a little bit controversial and probably has the most personal bias, but to me this is the best feeling raw carbon thermoform paddle, and that's why, at least to me, it's so good for control. The sweet spot is extremely well defined, so I always know exactly how the ball is going to shoot out, and on top of that, it's one of these new era thermoform paddles that has that extra little bit of plushness to them. This was the first thermoform paddle that I tried that has this unique ability to adapt to different types of shots. When you're hitting full pace ground strokes, it's very firm, but then it feels a lot softer in the control game. Rhombus has accomplished this with patent pending tech they call carbon fiber grid foamed edge, which allows the core to be a bit more flexible on different types of shots. And like I said, it works absolute wonders. It's an extremely addictive paddle that can work for a lot of different types of players, and the reason I've chosen the R1 over the R3 is because of this more aerodynamic Hyperion-like design to it. This shape moves quicker through the air than the classic elongated one of the R3 Nova, which means this paddle is easier to micro-adjust even midway through your swing. That can be extremely useful in the touch game, especially if you're trying to go for a deceptive type of touch shot, because you can feign one way and then easily switch it up to the other direction. Now do keep in mind, the Nova isn't crazy soft. This is still a paddle you're going to have to soften up your own hands with. It's not going to save you if you do put too much power on a dink, reset, or drop the way some other paddles on this list will. You still need to be careful, but for advanced players that won't be a problem because you should already have soft hands, and the great feel and the softness to rigidity ratio is one of the best out there. Alright, moving on from the Nova, coming in at number 4 we have the Yola Scorpius 16mm. The Scorpius is an absolutely insane paddle that I will admit will not work for everyone, but if you can figure it out, this is one of the most overpowered paddles once you get up to the kitchen. Obviously, it is only 16 inches long, so it is quite short, which means you're making a big sacrifice in leverage and losing out on a ton of power and spin potential. You will notice that from the baseline, you just can't hit out the same way you can on, say, a Perseus, for example, but if you are willing to work your way around that, let me explain why this paddle shines so bright up in the kitchen. So the paddle face is 8 inches wide, which is half an inch wider than on an elongated paddle, so the sweet spot will be significantly more forgiving, especially in the soft game. That means that you can get dialed in a lot easier because you don't have to worry that one tiny miss hit will be super punished every time. But then, the Scorpius separates itself from every other standard length paddle because of this very unique long handle that it has. The handle is 5¼ inches long, and when you combine that long handle with the short overall length, you get one of the most ridiculously quick and maneuverable paddles I've ever tried. That ridiculously high maneuverability means you have this ability to adjust the paddle at any given point. Obviously, that's great for quick reactions at the net, but it's also fantastic for what I mentioned earlier, the deceptive soft game. This is point blank the best paddle for that part of pickleball. The amount of times I've been able to do a small tweak of the wrist and completely change the trajectory of the ball is quite frankly ridiculous and a heck of a lot of fun too. Now again, the Scorpius is thermoformed, and to be honest, it is quite a bit firmer than all the other paddles on this list, even in the control game. But there is one thing that Yola paddles always seem to nail, and that's great feel. Good feel is crucial in the soft game because that's what allows you to feel super connected to the ball, and I always get that when I play with the Scorpius. To me, that's what separates it from the other paddle that has a similar shape like this, the Volair Forza Mach 2. I just always feel a bit more dialed into the ball on the Scorpius. So yes, the Scorpius might not soak up much of the ball's energy during impact, but it will always give me good feedback so that I know when I hit well or not so well and how to adjust from there. So the last two paddles we talked about were obviously thermoformed and quite rigid. We are going to pivot now 180 degrees to a very soft and classically molded Selkirk paddle, the Raw Carbon Vanguard Control Invicta. Selkirk has always been at the top of the control paddle game, and to me this new Raw Carbon Vanguard control stuff is really the pinnacle of that traditional control from the brand. Keyword being traditional. Everything about these paddles is geared for control. The thick core, the very plush response of that classic molding, but also the impeccable Selkirk feel. Selkirk and Yola have always stuck out to me as the two companies with the best feeling paddles, but I do have to say, I think the Vanguard 2.0 stuff was always a little bit too muted, and replacing that top sheet with a raw carbon one was kind of the perfect thing to do. They also changed the core from an X5 on the 2.0 to an X5 Plus here, and while the differences are subtle, and I still wouldn't say this has the purest ball feel, that has also made for an improvement on that mutedness of the 2.0. And by the way, for those of you who might be worried that the change in core might take away from that very user-friendly feel of the 2.0s, don't be. This still has one of the biggest and most forgiving sweet spots out there. There's also obviously a huge improvement in spin coming from the 2.0s, and that helps with control because one, spin adds control to the power game, and two, because you can hit those slower pace spin control shots. These are those low dipping passing shots that have become really important in pickleball, and the best paddles for that type of shot are softer raw carbon paddles, and these tick all those boxes. Overall, this is just what I would consider the industry standard for classic raw carbon paddles and the most amount of control they can provide. It is similar in a lot of ways to the original Ben Johns Hyperion, but I do think it is more refined and adapted to the modern game with slightly better feel, a little more spin, and obviously much more user-friendly maneuverability to it. Coming in at number 2, we have a paddle that would easily have been number 1 if it weren't for another paddle that's also ridiculously good, but the 6-0 Ruby kind of has it all. This paddle has a thermoformed unibody construction, so its most outstanding features are its power and spin, and yet those come at the expense of so little control that it's the second best control paddle right now, which is kind of ridiculous. You know what I said about the Nova with its impressive adaptability for different types of shots? Well, the Ruby has it too, it's just a little bit better here. The main ingredient for that is of course the Kevlar. Kevlar paddles are generally a little bit better for control than raw carbon ones because Kevlar flexes a little more during pocketing. The thing about Kevlar is that it snaps back into position very efficiently, and that's what means these paddles don't sacrifice much power in exchange for that better plushness. Now yes, the Ruby does have a more poppy and springy sensation than something like the Vanguard control paddles. That's never going to change with thermoforming, but that extra plushness does give you plenty of dwell time, and of course, this paddle has fantastic feel. I think the Ruby has one of the most premium, rich feels of any paddle right now. Like I said, sometimes plush can be a little mushy. Not here. The entry and exit points are extremely well defined during ball pocketing. Now, of course, the Ruby also has that now insanely popular hybrid shape, and that also adds to its control profile. It's kind of like combining the best of both worlds with that stability and consistency you you get with something longer, with that more maneuverability and deception potential that you get with shorter paddles. It's not going to be as wildly maneuverable as the Scorpius, so you won't get that magical ability to whip up any type of shot at any moment, but the shape will work for much more people because it is more solid. The Ruby is an absolutely incredible paddle. We've just scratched the surface by talking about how good its control is, but like I said, power, spin, pretty much everything is phenomenal here. So we'll talk about the Ruby more in the future, don't worry. So on to number 1, and this was the easiest decision of the day. The Selkirk Luxe Control Air paddles are by far the best control paddles right now. Epic, Invicta, whatever you want to go for, either works. I'm a bit more partial to the Invicta, but if you do want better maneuverability at the expense of some stability, go for the Epic. So what makes these paddles so special for control? Well, for one, they're 20 millimeters thick, so they're the thickest paddles I've ever play tested. And as you would expect, that means they are extremely plush for touch shots. That, plus the fact that these have some of the most forgiving cores out there. One, because they're made by Selkirk, and Selkirk makes fantastic cores. And two, because they're thermoformed, so the whole paddle holds up extremely well on impact. These are the easiest paddles to hit a touch shot with. Seriously, it almost feels like you're cheating. This paddle will save you on a number of occasions if you put too much power on a dink, reset, or drop. It almost feels like there's something coded inside this paddle to make the ball land perfectly in the kitchen every time. Now you look at that 20 millimeter core and very soft feel and you start to think, well, Luca, shouldn't that make the paddle very mushy like you keep saying? Well, no, not at all. Because these paddles are thermoformed, they have incredible feel for the ball. It's not a firm feel, but kind of like the Ruby, that plushness feels very rich and well-defined and not muted in any way. The Epic and the Invicta are some of the best feeling paddles right now. I actually think I prefer this feel to what I get on the Nova and the Ruby because of another extremely impressive playability characteristic these have. Everything about these control air paddles would make you think, okay, they're probably not good for power and spin, but that's just not the case. Again, it comes down to the thermoforming and whatever little bit of Selkirk magic they've sprinkled in there, but when you're hitting with power and spin, these paddles are extremely responsive. It's almost like they firm up right as the ball is about to leave the paddle face, and you can use that firmer feel to generate whatever pace and spin you want. It's super cool, and that's where these paddles set themselves apart to something like the Vanguard controls in terms of well-rounded playability. Honestly, if I get the chance to stop playtesting paddles for a couple of weeks, I'm going to take an Invicta and dial it into my game because like the Ruby, there are very few downsides, but it's also more forgiving and controlled than the Ruby, which is something my game can definitely do with. So there you have it. Those are the top 5 pickleball paddles for control right now. Honestly, I'm very happy I got to make this video because as much as I like to talk about spin and power, it is nice to switch it up and give the spotlight to control for a bit. Control is obviously super important in pickleball, and that's never going to change. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the technological pendulum swings back to control sooner rather than later. It's really these paddles that are making me think that. But for now, that is going to be the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you do want to demo any of the paddles we talked about here, you can come visit us in store, or you can check them out online at racketsandrunners.ca.